Welcome to this episode of Preaching the Word, a video series on preaching sponsored by the Dunk Tank and the Berman Ministry Center. My name is Dr. Stephen Reasor, and I'm a preacher and author, and I teach preaching at Berman University in Lacombe, Alberta. In this episode, we are focused on thematic sermons. This type of sermon is older than Christianity. A type of thematic structure was employed by ancient orators who saw speech as a way to advance an argument using 5 rhetorical parts: exordium, narratio, confirmatio, refutatio, and peroratio, to move from introduction to conclusion. While dynamic structures can also be thematic, we're studying the quintessential thematic sermon today, the essay-style sermon. An analogy might help us understand how an essay-style sermon works. Imagine a house. It has a hallway running from the front door to the back door. From the front porch, you can see to the backyard. Each room in the house opens onto this hallway. As you tour the house, you move from the entryway down the hallway to the living room. To move from the living room to the kitchen, you go back to the hallway and then enter the kitchen, and so on until you've toured each room and finally reach the back door. In the same way, an essay-style sermon begins with a central statement or theme. It examines 2 to 5 or more subpoints that are connected to that central hallway, that central statement, and then conclude with a restating of the central statement. When preaching this form of sermon, the preacher walks the congregation through the structure of the house from front to back, stopping in each room as they travel down the main corridor of the house. The logical strengths of this type of structure are evident by its use in writing papers for university. It is useful for keeping an audience tracking along a central theme and yet discussing different points along the way. The end of the sermon is visible from the beginning. There are no major surprises along the way, since the thesis, the central statement, or the theme of the sermon is introduced at the very front door. But there are some weaknesses to this sermon form. Number 1, unless the theme is inherently interesting or the presentation is especially stimulating, this type of structure does not naturally hold the interest of hearers. Number 2, a visual representation of this structure is clear and easily navigated, whether in a picture form or on a written document like a university essay. But sermons are audible events, which require audio markers to clearly define the main theme, diversions to each point, and the return to the main point. If these markers are not clear, then the hearers lose their place in the sermon and often stop listening. Number 3, there is little correlation between normal oral communication and such a structure. While we may sometimes list off several points to support an argument that we're making, 1, 2, 3, our normal mode of communicating is to simply move from one thing to the next without a thesis statement, without supporting points, and often without a conclusion. That being said, this sermon form is probably the most commonly heard sermon form in most churches. The form looks like this. There's an introduction, which states the central theme or thesis of the sermon. This is followed by point 1, then point 2, and point 3, and so on until we reach the conclusion. If you will recall our discussion about moves in the previous video series, we can view each unit in this sermon as a move, with all the various elements like move statements, illustrations, opposing viewpoints, etc. in each move, and that will be true for all the forms we look at in this series. So if I were to structure a sermon on Luke 17, 1 to 10 in this essay style, I might state the sermon's introductory thesis as faith requires obedience, which helps faith grow. My first point and second move would state faith requires obedience in the field. My second point could be faith requires obedience in the house. And my third point would be faith requires obedience to the master. My concluding move would then be obedience helps faith grow. Now, I'm confident that if you looked back at your old sermons, you'd be able to find an example or two of this sermon form. Your assignment for this sermon form is to consider how you might shape a sermon you're working on to fit this form. Outline the moves of the sermon like I have done. When you've finished your assignment, join me for the next episode of Preaching the Word, where we will move to the next type of structures, the textual structures. The first type of textual structure we will study is the text to application type of sermon.